we're going to go back to, so I talked to you a week ago, and then Al and Jen talked to remotely Wednesday. So I'm going to pick up where I left off on Monday a week ago. So basically talking more about EV policy. So this is just, so I went over to maybe just show you a few slides so you remember. I'm going to talk about just show a few slides so you can catch up to where we were. So we started talking about the zero emission vehicle mandate in California, and where it was first started in 1990, but it was so far ahead of its time that they had problems. Everyone opposed it, thought it was a bad idea. So there were delays, then further delays, and then more delays. And then they said, okay, we don't want to abandon it, so we're going to give our companies an option. So you can do a few fuel cell cars as a substitute for meeting all the requirements. So they tried that. That didn't work, and they softened it up in other ways. This is like 20 years ago, and this was a summary of what happened. From the last time it was changed in 2008, 2009, and this was just a summary of it. And then I told you about my travails, where that my role in it was that I helped design the ZEB mandate for part of. Was and am a board member, and some of the very strong activist advocates for electric vehicles thought I was selling out. So they made up this story that was largely false, published in LA Times. Fortunately, no one paid attention to it. And so I'm still here and still there. Okay, so any questions about, now that you remember what we did? I'm going to follow up on that, on the history of it, bring it right up to the present, actually right up to today. But are there any other kind of background questions? Okay, so, this is just kind of saying that whole thing that went on in the 1990s. You think about it, here we are, 2022. This is 32 years ago when California tried to start this transition to electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles. And many would say it was a failure, but another way of thinking about it. So these are some of the vehicles that were produced and sold during the 1990s. This one up here, EV1, that was what was made famous by the movie Who Killed the Electric Car? Anyone seen that? Is one of you? For historical purposes, I really recommend. I think you can get it pretty easily. I don't know, Netflix or somewhere. But that was the car. So what happened is GM, General Motors, which is Chevy, said that it was too expensive, not enough people were buying it, and so they were all leased. So they pulled the cars back from the leases for people, and they started crushing and sending them to the junkyard. So that was what motivated that movie, Who Killed the Electric Car? So they went through a whole, they had a whole list. Okay, who was the villain? And they, different people, different organizations. CARB was one of the villains. What the real villain was, was the battery. The batteries just weren't ready. They were expensive. They didn't last very long. They used the first versions of that used a lead acid battery. Some of the later ones used a nickel metal hydride battery, but that was like 1999, 2000. So anyway, some of them were pretty good cars, but didn't happen. But out of it came all the car companies started to work on electric vehicles. and they started they built these vehicles, they developed the expertise, because what was going on in the 1990s, it was really revolutionary, because car companies, they didn't know anything about electric vehicles, it's hard, it was a mechanical engineering culture. They had all mechanical engineers, and now you have electrical engineers. You're getting rid of the engine, which was the heart and soul of car companies. They distinguished themselves by the engines they made. So all of that, so this was a real threat. They didn't know how to do it. So in the 1990s, they started paying attention. They built some of these cars in small volumes. There was a lot more focus on the battery, so the battery started getting a lot better. So, you can say it was a failure, but you can also say it set the scene for what later is happening successfully. Okay, so just this is a policy class. So I'm going to teach you, I told you I'm a policy wonk. In my old age, I become a policy wonk, which means I love to delve into policy and see, like, why did they do this? Why didn't they do something different? How could it be better? So the ZEB mandate, what happened in the beginning was real simple, but then they kept trying to make it work. So CARB didn't want to, look bad, they have egg on their face that they did this policy that's a failure. So they kept coming up with little twists. You could get credits like for a fuel cell, although that's a good idea, but you could get credits, as I told you last time, for a very clean burning gasoline car, PHEV, partial zero emission, which it was not. And it doesn't even make sense how you need partial zero, right? You don't have to be an engineer. That doesn't make sense. So they came up with all these different things. So part of it was they said, okay, how do we compare different vehicles in terms of determining whether a car is meeting the requirements? So this is a really important question, and that question is going to stick around for a long time. Every government, California, European Union, US, are all struggling with how do you treat these different vehicles? So how do you have a battery EV, you have a plug-in hybrid, you have a fuel cell, you have some that are big batteries that go a long ways, others that have short batteries, don't go too far. Some of the PHEVs have bigger batteries that go further. Do you give them all the same credit? So let me ask that question. Okay. Just off the top of your head, what you know. Anyone want to kind of just suggest an appropriate scheme for how you would award credits? So you can see here, so you see one thing up here. What they did at some point along the way is they gave credits based on how far the vehicle could go on electricity. So if it went 50 miles, you got 2 credits. If it went 75 miles, you got 2.5. 100, you got 3. If it was a fuel cell that went 200, you got 5 credits. If it was a fuel cell went 300 miles, you get 7 or 9 things. If you had a battery EV that went 7 or 9, that went 300, you also got 7 or 9. Okay, so one way is just how far does it go on a charge? What about PHEV? How many credits would you give for a PHEV? Yeah.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the goals of the award credits based off the amount of emissions that you are not putting out. So I feel like that crediting system is probably, I mean, it's kind of in action here, right? So over 300 miles, the actual vehicle itself is putting for the 300 mile BEV. It's actually the actual vehicle itself is putting out 0 emissions, excluding the natural gas that's used to charge it or whatever from the power plant. So for a hybrid, like you were saying, it probably lands somewhere in the middle, is where I would imagine, because the whole rating system is about how much emissions are not, used
Okay, so that's exactly a really good question to ask to use. But so every proposal you're coming up with, I'm going to tell you what the flaw is. So I'm going to start with you. So if you think about it the way you were, it has 300-mile range, but that doesn't mean it's getting like that it's getting rid of 2.5, compared with 3 credits. It's not getting rid of 2.5 times as much because, if you have let's say a 200, even say 100-mile BEV, maybe you'll drive it a little less, just because it's not easy to get to LA with it, but you'll still drive it a lot of miles, probably not that fewer miles than a BEV with 300-mile range. So I think the criteria you're using is exactly right. But this doesn't necessarily, using range as a proxy for how many miles are replaced, gasoline car miles, it doesn't really work out well. It's in the right direction, but it's off by quite a big range. So maybe think about that metric though of replacing miles, and there's another way to do it. Yeah.
You can do a much more simple credit system where you just have like, let's say 2 credits for all EVs and 1 credit for all PHEVs, maybe 1 or 2, say, for.
How would you justify that?
Like the justification would be that all BEVs are basically 0 emission, so 300-mile one isn't really better per se. Like you could drive a 100-mile Leaf just as much as you drive a Tesla. Yeah, exactly. So in terms of the amount of electric VMT, be exactly the same for those 2 vehicles. And then PHEV, I mean, you could maybe pick the number in such a way that the number is sort of equivalent to the actual number.
Let's just look at PHEVs. So there's some PHEVs that only go 10 miles. First 3 to 6. But there's some hybrids that'll go 80 miles. You treat them equally.
I mean, I'm not suggesting it's actually the best thing. Maybe you could have it be scaled in some way, but
Okay, but your criterion is simplicity.
Yeah.
And what I've learned as a regulator is that goes right up to the top of the list of important criteria. So that's a really good one. Any other ideas on how to determine how many credits to go get all these different types of vehicles? Just get creative. How are they different? What's different that you can use? There. So we talked about battery range, all electric range. That's one. I guess the 2-in-1 credit is sort of a simplification of that. It's more of a simplification of the idea of how many miles do you go on electricity. What? Okay, yes.
Thank you. About like the mission of like inversely, like
You have 3%. PhD.
if it's producing sound,
You think you have actually emission also. Yeah, it is a good question. Okay, so that's another one. So no, but okay, so let me just okay, hold on a second. So if the vehicle was operating in California where emissions from power plants are really low, don't get all this solar, wind, hydro. But then you go to a place like Kentucky, 90% coal. So the car is being used in California. Should it get the same credits as if it's in? Yeah.
theoretically,
That's exactly right. But you know, there is, okay, but think about it, there might be a way. Yeah,
So mine kind of goes like maybe hand in hand to what she's saying about it. So maybe total emissions, say, I guess highway department or any other pollutant, per say 100 miles or whatever, you know, and systems you want to say for the car. So say for the VEV, it's not going to have any tailpipe emissions, but the upstream emissions should be considered depending on where you are, I guess, or maybe
could even be time of day, right?
Right. Yeah. So also, say for the plug-in hybrid, different plug-in hybrid, you're going to have emissions over, say, just over 100 miles. So maybe by weight of ultimate emissions that they.
Right, so it's going back to that criteria. It's like how many gasoline miles do you replace, or you could with how many emissions do you replace. You know, that's actually a more technically correct way if you were
Much more.
a scientist or a student or a professor.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it's definitely not simplistic like that. But
Yeah.
could be done in a way.
You know, another way of doing it is you could just do it on the overall efficiency of the vehicles. How many kilowatt hours per mile does it use? I like that one personally. I'm going to be promoting that. Anyone think about why I like that one in particular? Yeah.
System, have your Jaguar, whatever, like all of our parts. Wait, electricity, but bring up battery and things and credit as like most. That's part of it.
Vehicles are lately. You know, if you go back, there an F-150 today, which is the Ford pickup truck, is the most popular vehicle sold in America. If you compare the size of that F-150 to what it was 30 years ago, it's literally twice the size. If you compare, so if you look at models that have been, you know, that we've had for a long time. So like the Honda Civic or Honda Accord. If you look at the original Honda Civic Accord back in the 1970s, it really was so much smaller. Wouldn't even believe how much smaller. So every year a new model comes out. Every time a new model comes out, it's bigger and bigger and bigger. We really need, I know some of you probably think we do, but it's like math. I mean, if you look at it in terms of all the energy and materials that goes into building them, you think about how much energy they use, even if they're electric. You know, that new F-150 that's electric, it's using twice as much energy as, you know, a old F-150 would have. You know, just because it's so much heavier and so much more powerful. Okay, so that's why I like the idea is it basically puts pressure, it rewards companies that do smaller vehicles. You know, you can do efficiency in a technical sense, like an engineer would say, okay, for the amount of energy in and work out. But if you think about it more broadly in terms of just how much energy is being used to move your vehicle, whatever size it is, mile. All right, so the point of it is that I'd like to see policy that rewards smaller vehicles that are more efficient. Okay, so I just laid out for you, this is why when you think about policy, here's just one simple question, right? One simple question, how you adopt a policy to encourage electric vehicles. And look how complicated it gets. Well, isn't that fun? I think so. Okay. So here's just another characterization of the credit system. So this is, calculating what the driving range is. So first they did a step function, and they converted into a straight line function. PHEVs were down here. And then it just shows for different vehicles, what their range was and therefore how many credits they would get. This is the system that's in place now, and we're about to change this whole system. I'm going to tell you about it. And the hint is this system got so complicated, and there's got to be a simpler way. Okay, now one of the things about these ZEB is, all those credits you get. So if you were Tesla and you're making vehicles got 300 miles of range, you were getting that 7 or 9 credits per vehicle, compared to the battery EVs or less. But even so Tesla was earning lots of credits. But on top of that, the car companies, okay, let me back up. So these, for a car company, if it cannot meet the mandated requirement that you have to produce so many vehicles, actually, technically, you have to sell vehicles that worth a certain number of credits. If you can't meet that requirement, or you don't want to, or you think it's too expensive, you can buy credits from someone else that is doing better than the standard. And so some of the regular legacy car companies were doing better, but Tesla was doing way better because all they were selling was electric vehicles. So they didn't have any requirements at all because it was all electric. So therefore they were accumulating a massive number of credits for their vehicles, and they were selling them to the other car companies, to Chrysler and GM and Ford and Toyota and everyone else. And so those companies were making a decision that it was just easier to buy the credits. So that single little tiny policy is the reason that Tesla exists today. If that policy didn't exist where they could sell credits to other car companies, they would have gone bankrupt. There's no question about it. They came so close to bankruptcy a couple of times. And when they sold some of their initial cars, like the Model S, 2012, 2013, the car would cost about $80,000. They would get about 20, the credits they sold to other companies that they accumulated for that car was worth about $20,000. So for every car they sold, other car companies were paying them $20,000. That $20,000 kept them from bankruptcy. Yes.
I was just about to ask what the cost
For the credits.
for credit.
Yeah, so the credits.
So,
Yeah, so the credits were actually, it's a market, so you don't really know because it's trades between companies. But we kind of know because we got this kind, you can go back and calculate it. But they were getting about probably $3,000 or $4,000 per credit month. So we know it was not much more than that because there's a penalty built into the law. It says that if a car company doesn't meet the requirements, they have to pay a fine of $5,000 per credit. So it had to be less than that because otherwise the company would just pay a fine. So it's $3,000 or $4,000. So if you got 7 credits, that's $21,000. And that's, to this day, every car they sell, they probably now still get about $3,000 or so, like a Model 3. And they sell credits in Europe also. So this is another little attribute about how this policy was designed. Yes.
I don't know how to put this in the slide here, but there was actually a paper that the specific earnings reports from Tesla. Over a 5-year period. They report in their earnings exactly how much it will come. Right, so you can see the graph. Use that to calculate how the price of the credit changes over time. And they stopped reporting that information. Now we don't really know. But for a while, we could pretty easily tell what was going on in the credit card. Now it's a little more.
Right, and that's exactly the same kind of analysis that was done here that they reported. Yeah. But you can see here, revenue from regulatory credits and then the income of the company. So, starting recently, they actually have been making real profit. For many, many years, Tesla was losing money. But they did start making profit. But you can see the regulatory credits were worth more in many cases than it was greater than the actual profit. So they didn't, another way of saying that is if they didn't have the credits, they'd still be losing money. Right, at least up till, well, yeah, right up to here. All right, so 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, Governor Newsom came out with an executive order. And remember, we talked about executive orders a little bit, and this is an executive order where he's saying, this is what I want. And I want my government agencies to implement, what I want. So this is what he said is what I want, an executive order. And I'm going to go, some of it's about trucks and some about cars. So just the first line there is he wanted 100% of all light duty vehicles to be ZEB by 2035. So he gave that task to CARB, to my agency, and we had to figure out, does it make sense? Can we do it? How do you do it? How many credits do you give? All the other pieces to it. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes the new proposal for how to implement this. Okay, so this is it. Okay, so for me, this is the really exciting part because I'm going to be in 2 weeks. This is coming before the CARB board. So the staff of CARB, they put together a proposal. They talk to CARB companies and NGOs and environmental justice groups and all kinds of people. And they have come up. There's a 200-page document. Actually, maybe I should post that. Some of you might be interested. Anyway, so it's called ACC2, that's Advanced Clean Cars 2. So the last ZEB mandate that was adopted was in 2012, the so-called Obama, where it was done at the same time as the Obama standards for greenhouse gases. So that is now referred to as ACC1. It wasn't called that then, but ACC1, ACC2. Okay, so here's what's in this proposal. So it's coming to the board June 9th, and we're going to debate. It's going to be an all-day meeting. Actually, I recommend you can listen to it. It's a webcast. So it'll be fast. I think you'll find it really interesting. If you're interested at all in electric vehicle policy, you'll find it interesting. I'm going to tell you what the debates are, what the issues are, and what the basic elements are. So the most basic part is a very aggressive requirement imposed on the car companies to get to 100% in 2035. So I'll give you the exact graphic in a moment. Another one is making the car companies offer a warranty on the batteries. In other words, it's saying that if you sell an electric car, you have to have a warranty on your batteries for the consumer, so that basically there's a guarantee that it's a good battery. And I'll give you some of them. So the issue there, so you start thinking about policy. So, on the top of that, off the top of your head, man, that sounds like a reasonable idea. And it is. And probably some version of it will be adopted. But when you do that, you're raising the cost, because you're forcing the company to make sure that it won't be failing on the performance of its batteries. So therefore, they make the batteries a little bigger, or they make them, they spend more money on it, which you can say good, but it raises the price, the cost, and therefore the price. And maybe having cheaper, maybe leaving it to the marketplace. You know, maybe let consumers, you know, news, if batteries are not good batteries, you know, we'll hear about it really quickly. And so maybe you can just say, let the marketplace figure it out instead of getting all this government regulation. So when you get into, you know, this is getting into the larger political world where, you know, you have this spectrum of people that believe in more government or less government. You know, usually the Democrats believe in more government. And usually the Republicans believe in less government, or at least it used to be that way. Maybe the neoliberal way of thinking is less government is better. But anyway, so that's another question, raises the cost. So what they're doing is saying what we were just talking about, simplifying. Now they're saying all battery EVs are equal, no matter how big they are, no matter what their range is. And not only that, all plug-in hybrids are also worth the same as all BEVs. So all PHEVs and all BEVs are worth 1 credit. They're all the same. Now they did put in some key provisions that said a plug-in hybrid had to get, you know, at least a certain number of miles and some other conditions. But basically now the proposal is everyone's equal. And that's the simplicity. Yeah.
So in doing that, is the total number of credits required annually going to decrease?
Okay, so they got rid of that whole credit system. So they got in the new credit system, it's just basically 1 car, 1 credit. So the credits don't mean much, won't mean much. So this new debt one doesn't take effect until 2026. And I'll show you the trajectory on that. So what they did though is if you had those old credits like today, then you have to convert them into new credits. So they came up with a whole system for converting old credits and new credits. Okay, so the other part is for the PHEVs, they said, okay, we're going to let PHEVs get the same credit as a BEV, but it has to have much longer range than most of them do today. So it says that the first few years, 2026 to 2028, the range has to be at least 35 miles. And then after that, it has to be at least 50 miles. Yeah.
What is the battery warranty?
Okay, I'm going to get the battery warranty. Okay, so this is kind of a complete turnaround by CARB and many advocates, because it used to be, we said, plug-in hybrids, they're a transitional technology, but really it's BEVs, pure BEVs, that's the way to go. And so we're going to do everything we can to discourage PHEVs. But that philosophy has changed. And now they're saying, you know, like I said, it's worth 1 credit, you know, with these conditions. But the other condition they applied is that even though you get 1 credit equal, you can only 20% of your compliance. In other words, you know, if you have, you know, 1/4 of your cars have to be electric. So say that's 100,000 vehicles. You have 100,000 EVs you have to sell in 2026. It's saying only 20% of those can be PHEVs. So they're, you know, they made the PHEVs have to have a minimum mileage, and they can only be a relatively small part of the compliance by the company. Okay, and here's the other big, okay, here's a really big issue. So California is adopting this, but remember that other states have the option of either imitating California or EPA. Well, EPA doesn't have any ZEB mandate. So if you want electric cars in your state, then you'll probably want to adopt California's ZEB mandate. But here's the catch. California has been working really hard to make this transition to EVs. You know, we put lots of money into chargers. We have all this, we have a lot of incentives we give out. We talked a little bit about that to consumers. We've worked with local governments to accelerate the permitting of charging stations. The electric utilities are working out a deal with their regulator, which is Public Utility Commission. You know, you have Governor Newsom out there, you know, saying all these good things about EVs. This is not what's happening in the other states. So California now has, I don't know, 15% of sales are zero emission right now. In other states, it's typically 4 or 5%. So now so the state adopts California's requirement. It's saying, you know, we're going to go all the way to 100% also. Even though we really haven't worked that hard at it, not nearly as hard as California. We don't have as much incentive money. We're not giving out as much money for chargers. We're not doing a lot of stuff to make it happen. So if you make it really aggressive for California, you're making it really, really aggressive for these other states, so-called Section 177 states. There's 15 or 16 of those now. So one could argue maybe California should ease up a little bit, make it a little more realistic for the other states to reach that standard. Because really the point is not, you know, to reduce greenhouse gases in California. The point is to reduce it in the US and in the world. So if we can, you know, get all those other states to adopt electric vehicles, even though it's a little less aggressive than we think California can or should do, that's a good thing. So there's some people arguing, you know, maybe this is too aggressive what California is doing. Maybe it should soften up. And that's a realistic thing to say. So one of the things California is doing is making it easier for the other states. They're coming up with what they call flexibility. So really, if you think, okay, this is policy, remember? So who's responsible for, like, there you are in New York. And New York has a requirement to get to, and I'll show you the numbers in a moment, to get to 35% in 2026 of sales. So who's responsible for that 35%? Is it the governor of New York? Who is it? Someone said something.
The consumers.
What's that?
Voters.
Voters? No, not voters. What's that?
Consumers.
Not consumers. It's the car company. This is a mandate on the car company. So we have a requirement, the state has a requirement, but if they don't meet the requirement, nothing happens to them. But the car company, that 38% or that 35%, that is for the car company. Each car company in each state needs to sell that many vehicles or that proportion of their vehicles. And so if you're the governor or you're head of the, you know, the Air Resource Board of New York, you can say, sure, 100%, that sounds great. I love the idea. But they're not accountable. It's the car companies that have to do it. And the car companies don't do it, then they pay huge fines and penalties, and or more likely they're going to buy credits from Tesla. I'm not an advocate for Tesla, but you know what? Tesla's in a really good shape given what we're doing here, because everyone's going to be buying more credits from Tesla going forward. Not recommending buying their stock, but okay. And then another piece. So now, environment in the policy world these days, in California, environmental justice is like a top priority. So everything you do in California has to take into account environmental justice and somehow being responsive. So what they do, what the proposal is that, and I'll give you some of the details in a moment, is a car company, if it sells an electric vehicle to someone living in a EJ neighbor community or low income neighborhood community, then they get extra credit. The company gets extra credit, but they have to sell it at a discount. So if they sell cars in EJ communities at a discount, then they get bonus credits, which helps them meet the requirements. Yes?
Who decides what these communities are?
Who decides what?
What these communities are, where they are, whether
Okay, so California has done an exercise. They've analyzed every community in the state. They looked at it, pollution levels, income levels. And pollution would be both things, waste, power plant, both. And then they look at income. I think they have one or two other things. So communities across the state, some are designated as EJ communities. Okay, so here's the trajectory. 2026, 35% of the sales of every car company must be zero emission. So roughly 1/3 in 2026. In 2030 is 68, so at roughly 2/3, and then 100%. Yeah.
So just to clarify, so in California and any state who adopts California's policy, we're saying that by 2035, gas cars are not allowed to be sold at all.
Correct. So some people call it a ban on gasoline cars, and I guess in some way it is, but it's really being, structured as a requirement to sell electric zero emission vehicles. But once you get to 100, it is a ban. Gasoline. And this is almost, so the final vote on this will be in August. There's a meeting, the first meeting, June 10th, and then August 11th will be the final decision. Almost for sure, something very close to this will be that. The 100% is almost guaranteed. It might tweak the numbers in between, but this is basically what's going to happen. Yeah.
What are the penalties
If they don't meet it?
Yeah.
So, it was $5,000 per credit before, which would equate to, $10,000 or $15,000 per year. I don't remember what it is for this. So it's probably something in that range.
But it's monetary.
What's that? It's monetary. Although if you don't, yeah, it's monetary. I mean, the way companies work, they have to say, throw them in jail. Okay, so here's the durability and battery warranty issue. And I just had a long meeting with General Motors this morning. And we went through and debated this, so actually it's fresh in my mind. But to put it simply, there's kind of two pieces to it that are really basically the same. So one is a durability requirement. They're saying your car, okay, 80% of certified range. That means you can't have more than 20% degradation of the battery or of the range, for 10 years or 150,000 miles. Okay, so You know, like I have an old Tesla and it had about 275 miles when we got it. That was like 8 or 9 years ago. And now it gets about 250. So it's got about 10% degradation, you know, it lost 25 miles. So it has about 10, so it's at about 90% now after, you know, 8 years or so. So it would probably meet that requirement. So that's what that durability says. Now, in addition to that, they have a battery warranty that says that, okay, so the difference here is a warranty is for the consumer. The durability applies to directly to the company. You know, in the end, it's kind of the same thing. So I don't know, you know, unless someone really wants to get into it, you know, we should just leave it this way, that basically it's saying that the batteries are only allowed to degrade a certain amount. And if they degrade more than that, they get penalized. Or like in the case of the battery warranty, it means there may be a recall. So they have to recall the batteries, the cars, and replace them or fix them, you know, to restore the battery range.
You talk about degradation across different automakers. Why isn't there been, or is there push to standardize that?
Standardize the battery itself.
I guess that
Because this is capital.
so, yeah, that's that would be to when not the productions.
That's right. So every, you know, there's a lot of companies making batteries. I mean, you know, one reason to standardize batteries, battery swapping. Talked about battery swapping at all? Yes. Okay, to really make that work, well, every battery does have to be the same. Because if you, well, it would be most efficient if they were all the same. Otherwise, you have to have 100 batteries of every type. You know, if every model has its own type battery, then your battery swapping station has to have a whole bunch of those to be able to swap it in when someone comes. So if you standardize it, then you could have just one type of battery. You don't have to have that huge inventory of batteries. And you would just, you know, and it would make it easy and be efficient. But, you know, even one company doesn't want to standardize across its different makes. You know, they want different size batteries, you're putting it in differently, bigger and smaller. And then if you go across companies, even more so, and they have their own suppliers. So no one wants to standardize. That's probably
Maybe the cell type.
What's that?
The battery cell type.
You could do the cell
Not the
type.
size, say, but
Yeah.
so to kind of prevent degradation, say it's the chemistry.
So for this, yeah, you could, but then, you know, all the balance of plant, you know, it's complicated, you got thermal management, all that stuff. Though. You probably know more about that because you spent time in class on that, right? You're all experts. Okay, so you know, part of the motivation for this, okay, it comes back to environmental justice again, and that is that, you know, people usually buy a car and then they sell it, you know, as a used car to someone or something. So people that are less affluent, and you know, I said this last time, you know, which actually includes middle class, because only about 1/3 of new cars are sold, or all the new cars are sold to about 1/3 of households. In other words, 2/3 of households in the United States buy used cars. So if the battery is not very good, and if it's only going to last 8 years or 7 years, then whoever buys that used EV is going to be stuck with a lemon. They're going to have to pay a lot of money to get a new battery. So this is kind of intended as consumer protection and sort of an EJ strategy to, you know, make sure that by the time it gets to lower income people, you know, they don't have a lemon, or you know, where they have to spend a lot of money to get it. That's a motivation. So that's when you think about, are all these rules necessary? So they add costs. Because for the companies to comply with this, they're going to overbuild the battery to make sure that they're in compliance. So they overbuild it, that costs more money, and that means the used cars will cost less. I mean, that means it costs more money. That means the used cars will also cost more. So, you know, this idea of protecting the consumer is not exactly straightforward. Because it could be more expensive, then you get more guaranteed. You get a guarantee, but it's more expensive. Does everyone understand that issue? Batteries. Okay, so back to this idea about other states. So here you see this is 2021. What was that wrong? Oh yeah. So the states that are in the dark green here, that means more than 6% of their vehicles sold in 2021 were electric vehicles. So you see 3 states, you know, the West Coast states, Hawaii, and District of Columbia. But even here, you know, California last year was about 12%. Oregon and Washington, I think, were around 7%. And then everyone else is much smaller. So now many of these states are going to say, okay, we want electric vehicles too. And so that's where we are right now. Okay, so some of the policy design questions. So we've talked about this kind of similar. Okay, life cycle analysis. You've gone over life cycle analysis here in this class, right? Yeah. Okay, so to what extent do you use life cycle analysis to design this policy? I mean, one simple way of saying that is, do you make car companies responsible for upstream emissions? Now, you could make them responsible for the emissions to manufacture the vehicle and the battery. That's not unreasonable, but it gets, you know, a little weak, you know, argument to say they should be responsible for upstream emissions. And even, do you really want that to be true? Because, you know, we're kind of counting on all the electricity becoming, you know, near zero carbon, being renewable eventually, even Kentucky. And it's going to take a lot of years before Kentucky has a lot of electric vehicles. So maybe we should just say, we don't care what your grid looks like. We just want to get electric vehicles there as well. You know, that's one way. Anyway, so LCA, that's one of the questions. How do you assign credits to ZEBs? So we talked a lot about that. Credit for energy efficiency, that's where I advocated, yes, let's do it. Kilowatt hours per mile. Get rid of those, you know, Hummers, those massive vehicles, or at least discourage them a little bit. And then credit trading. So that's a really key provision. Okay, so I talked about how it benefited Tesla, but the theory behind it is it motivates companies, you know, to be innovative. You know, it motivates. I mean, that's what one of the things that Tesla figured out right from day one is that they would be getting these credits. So they invested a lot more money in electric vehicle production, manufacturing, because they knew they would be getting those credits. They could sell credits to other car companies. So tradable credits. So if you take an economics class, they'll say this is, you know, this is economic efficiency. This is what stimulates innovation. This is what leads to more investment by letting. So basically, you're saying if a company is more efficient or better or more innovative, they're going to get rewarded. And so there's a incentive to be more innovative and so on. So economists love the idea of trading, credit trading, emissions trading. And I happen to love it too, because I think that is correct. And it does provide that extra incentive. All right. Okay, so that's everything about the ZEB policy. Anything else you want to hear about it? I know. Yes.
And one thing I want to touch on a little bit is how is this policy tracked with cafe?
How does that mandate?
Yeah.
Cafe?
In the sense of like,
Yeah, because Alan talked about that.
yeah. But I'm just curious to hear your take on that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, actually, I think he has it there. I remember we had a debate over this one. So CAFE standard or greenhouse gas standard on vehicles, if you do electric vehicles, that means that you can sell more Hummers and, you know, big vehicles. But this is zero and offsets it. So that's how it basically works. You know, there is different ways. The CAFE rules have changed. And I'm not actually Alan follows it pretty carefully, so whatever you told me is correct. But what used to be like with the greenhouse gas standards, it used to be an electric car that was worth got double credit. They gave it a multiplier because as a way of providing more incentive for EVs. And so a lot of people complained about that. And they said you're watering down the CAFE program or you're watering down the gas standards. You know, my response to that would be, well, we do want to create incentives for EVs. And if you're, you know, and yes, it's allowing them to do other things, but if that's true, just bump up that CAFE requirement, bump up that greenhouse gas standard. So it's not fixed. So change that. So if you're going to give extra credit for EVs, just bump up. That's what that's my take. Okay. So have you talked about costs of electric vehicles? So okay, so you did total cost of ownership. All right, good. So I go this quickly. So if you haven't seen this graph, on this. Okay, so the whole point of this is, okay, so we're going to look at it from a policy perspective. So we know in terms of total cost of ownership that that electric vehicles are getting pretty close to being competitive with gasoline cars on average. Actually, the gasoline price is $6. I haven't done the calculation, but it's probably preferable for an electric vehicle today, but who knows how long the $6 will stay. So, so you could say, well, they're competitive, and in many cases, you know, there's electric vehicles are superior. You know, if you drive the car, the EV 20 or 1,000 or 30,000 miles, it's very much cheaper than on a total cost of ownership basis than a gasoline car. For sure. So anyway, the question then becomes, so what do we do about it? I mean, if this is true, why do we need any policy for EVs? If they're better, cheaper.
We decided that there'll soon be economically superior options.
What's
Just
that?
because of total cost. Like you're saying that for instance, they will soon be economically superior. Is that because the cost of the vehicle, the upfront costs are going to be less, or the total cost of the in regards to gas price?
Yeah, you do have to do it. Okay, so a TCO analysis. Okay, yeah. So when you do a TCO analysis, you can't just say it costs today or this year, right? Because what you're doing is comparing the fixed cost of buying the vehicle. So the purchase cost is today, right, but all the cost savings are, you know, next year, 10 years from now.
But most people aren't going to be doing that kind
Exactly.
of like long game
And figuring out
analysis,
doing
how
the
much
discounted, you know, discounted analysis.
EVs
Okay,
compared to like the Acura.
right. And that's exactly. Yes.
I was saying another thing too on top of that. They, like, for example, some people would say that they don't care that it's economically superior, that they want the gas car, they want the performance car that runs on gas.
Yeah.
So that would be another thing.
Okay, so there you do, between those two, you've got the answer. Is we need intervention because one, okay, first of all, people don't think in terms of total cost of ownership. In fact, we had a study done 6 or 7 years ago about how people think about buying an electric vehicle, and they did all these focus groups and interviews. They did not find a single person that thought in buying whether a gasoline car or electric car that thought about it in terms of total cost of ownership. Some of them were a little vague. They said, well, I know I got to think about the maintenance costs and the gasoline costs. But even the engineers, people that are engineers, financial managers, no one really explicitly had done a TCO analysis for a car they purchased. So people don't think this way. Number one. And number two, people have lots of reasons for not wanting an electric vehicle. Could be political. We used to call GM government voters because, we bailed out General Motors in the last recession, government did. So a lot of Republicans call it government voters. So anyway, people have all their own issues. So as we just said, people do not make purchase decisions based upon TCO. And so as a result, the reality is, I think we're going to need incentives for people to buy these vehicles all the way up to 100% more. Because people are going to resist all the way up to that. And in fact, probably the last 20 or 30% are probably people are going to resist even more because there are people that were ideologically opposed, or that they, live in conditions that make it hard, like apartment building, housing charge. Okay, so here's just a summary if you want to look at it. It's on tables available to you. This is for today. These are the incentives that are available from California. There's also the federal incentive. We talked about that last time, $7,500 that you get. Want to take a break? Yeah, okay. Maybe nicer today than I was last. Okay, 5-minute break. One of the incentives in California, and if you look at it, they, the rebate. Okay, so if you're above the income cap, if your income is over 135,000 for individual, or for joint 200,000, then you don't get any credits except for the fuel cell. For the BEVs, you don't get any incentive money. And if you're low income, you get much bigger, 2 to 3 times more for your car, if you're low income than you would other, a middle income person. So, this is part of this, new politics of trying to get, give everyone access to these vehicles. So the downside of this, and it's, it's a good aspiration. The downside is that, if we really want to get cars out there, EVs, the reality is, even these people are very price sensitive. Most of these are still price sensitive. And so it becomes kind of a tension to what extent you're being responsive to equity considerations and so much to environmental considerations. So I just leave that as a thought. Okay, so have you heard about PHEVs? Okay, so Alan and I have worked on this a little bit in the past. So all these incentives, they cost money. All of us are paying for those incentives. This is government, if government is giving money, then someone's paying for it. So what about an idea where taxpayers are not? So that's the idea of fee-based. Fee-based is, the word means fee and rebate have been combined together. Fee-based. And the idea here is, at least the way we're doing it now in California, is that if you buy an electric vehicle, you get a rebate. If you buy a gasoline vehicle, you pay a fee. And you can balance the two. You structure it in such a way, how much the rebate is, how much the fee is, whether all gasoline cars pay or not. But you can design it so the fees equal the rebates. And that way, government is not involved. Government doesn't, taxpayers are not paying. Now, other consumers are paying. So this is a case where those consumers that buy a gasoline car are subsidizing those who buy an electric vehicle. But from an economic theory, it's really elegant because you're changing the price signal. You're providing a incentive. You're providing an advantage for something that you want that is good for society. We've decided that electric vehicles are a good thing. We want to promote it. We want to get there as fast as possible. So a fee-based is a really, it's a good market-based policy for achieving that. Okay, so you make it revenue neutral, meaning fees equal rebates, at no cost to government taxpayers. Yes.
So I guess one question with PHEV is, so let's say a gasoline car will cost you like $1,000 more. What's to stop you from going to like Nevada to buy your car?
I know that is okay. So we've got to come up with some way. Okay, so think about it. Is you could just buy a car, you get you get the incentive money, you buy it, and then you just go sell it right away across the border, Nevada, Mexico, anywhere, and maybe you sell it for about the same price, and then you get to keep that incentive money. Another way of thinking about it is that government is subsidizing some, others, because otherwise, in the vehicle, you could give the incentive to someone, and even if they keep it for a year or two, and then they sell it, then California taxpayers are paying, everyone else, to be able to get a cheaper car. So yes, somehow we have to build into it a way that you have to own the car for at least 3 years. And I think that's the way it's structured now. Otherwise, you have to pay the money back. But of course, if you move to another state, you get that money back probably. So that is a concern. So this fee-based idea has been implemented actually in Europe for many years. So in France, they call it bonus malus. That means plus and minus, plus and negative. And so this is a little more, this is the details that we get complicated. There, they did it not just for EVs, gasoline, diesel. They did it based on the energy efficiency, or actually the CO2 emissions of the vehicle. So in that case, they just said, okay, if your car is more than 138 grams per kilometer, then you pay a fee. If it's less, you get a rebate. And that's actually the way it was originally. Most of us had thought about it. was, you would apply it to all vehicles and you just have we call it pivot point. That would be the midpoint. And so, rebates on one side, fees on the other. But now we kind of back to the idea of simplifying. I think the way to go is we just say electric vehicles, you get a rebate. And it might be all rebates get the same, all EVs get the same rebate. But we go back to the same discussion before. Should we differentiate it? If you get a small EV, you get a bigger rebate. If you get a Hummer, an electric Hummer, should you get a rebate? Or should you get a small rebate or a big rebate? You could argue if you get an electric Hummer, you're replacing a lot more green, CO2 than if you replace, a Honda Civic. Just because if it was a gasoline vehicle, it would be guzzling huge amounts of gasoline. So wouldn't you want to reward that? So there's different ways of thinking about it. Nothing's right, nothing's wrong. It really comes down to what's easiest. Remember, I gave you a list of criteria for good policy, what's easy to administer, what's effective, and so on. So no right answer, but that's what's fun about policy. Figuring out how do you get policy that makes the trade-offs between all those considerations, gets the job done. And so, okay. What about trucks? How much have you talked about electric trucks or ZEB trucks in this class at all?
Well, no, we had actually, I guess not sure.
From who gave the letter? Who?
Professor,
Oh, okay. All right, so go back to that executive order from a year and a half ago. So we went over the first part of, well, we moved it around a little bit. But we talked about the light duty vehicle, but now also in that executive order that 100% of all trucks and buses on the road, not just new ones, but all would be ZEBs by 2045. He did say where feasible, and we'll figure out what that means. Okay, so CARB got the job again. Okay, CARB, you're reliable. Figure out how to make this happen. And so, okay, so I'll go over in a moment how it's making it happen. Okay, so there's lots of trucks and ZEB trucks, you probably heard of some of them. Okay, so here's the regulation that was adopted. Did he talk, Professor Joller talk about this? Probably not.
Yeah.
Oh, he did?
I want to say yes. For sales mandates.
Yeah, so this is sales mandate. So it was called, okay, so the technical word acronym is Advanced Clean Truck Rule, ACT, but it's really a ZEB sales mandate. So this is what it is. So it breaks it up into different types of trucks. Okay, so this is where you get into the simplicity and complexity thing. Broke it up into 3 categories of trucks, class 2B and 3. So those are smaller. So this is bigger than light duty vehicles. So these are medium duty. So this would be like van, not minivans, but like Amazon, UPS type vans that are delivering in neighborhoods. That's class 2B and 3. Class 4 to 8 is basically all the other trucks except for tractors. That means the long haul tractors that are pulling a trailer. A tractor means it's pulling a trailer. So those are the big trucks going long distance. So most trucks, so here's the requirement for each of those categories. And remember again, this is a regulation, a regulated party. You always have to ask that question, okay, who's responsible? So it's the truck manufacturer, just like, it's Freightliner, it's Mack, it's Peterbilt, Volvo truck. Okay, just like the car company, it's GM, Chrysler, and all the others on the car side. So these are the truck companies. So they have to sell, starting in 2024, That's kind of like less than 2 years. 5% of their smaller trucks must be ZEBs, 9% of most, the rest of their trucks, and 5% of the big long haul tractors have to be ZEBs. And it increases pretty fast. So by 2035, 75% of most trucks will need to be ZEB. And so we're going to be adopting new rules that extend this beyond 2035, and we're probably going to around say 100% by 2040. This is already adopted. This is the law of California. It's in place. It's pretty radical, really. I mean, everything we're talking about here is really radical. We're transforming all of our vehicles in a pretty short amount of time. And I left it, I didn't mention, I don't know if we're talking about this class, but all the off-road equipment. I mean, it's everything from leaf blowers have to go electric. Tractors, farm tractors have to go. Everything's going to go electric. That's pretty radical. And buses too. And so we already passed the law, the regulation on buses, when I say we, CARB, and we adopted it, I think it was over 2 years ago. And it says all transit buses in California must be zero emitting in 2040, but buses last about 12 years or so. So that means by 2027, 2028, all new buses will be zero emission, either battery or fuel cell. Now, there's a lot of incentives, the bus companies are all going. So buses are government, and all of the transit agencies are in deep trouble in the US. So we kind of piled on with, I am worried about it, what's going to happen. People are not riding the buses, and the buses, transit agencies are cutting back service. And now we're going to make them do this too. It's a little iffy, but yes.
So you said that you're worried about the e-buses and how much that we're trying to push this in there. What makes you worry more about this than you do about personal vehicles?
Because transit agencies are government agencies, but they tend to they're heavily subsidized already. And they've been losing a lot of ridership has gone way down on buses, on transit buses. And so they're cutting service, and transit provides a fundamental public service in our society for all those people who can't drive or can't afford a vehicle. And so now here is this fundamental public service that government is providing. Now we're making it even less feasible. We're undermining a vital public service. So that's what worries me. Plus, consumers. So, the thing with consumers and EVs is the regulated party is the car company. It's not the consumer. So the car company has to sell you that car. So if they can't sell it to you, they'll have to reduce the price until you do buy it. So, I mean, that's not for every individual consumer, but basically that's what's going to be happening. They're going to be cross-subsidizing internally. So it's kind of like a fee bait, only within a company. So what they're going to have to do is raise the prices of their SUVs and lower the prices of their EVs, just because they can't, lose money forever. So they have to keep their profit and revenue going. So what they'll do is they'll be subsidizing EVs. I mean, that's the only way this is going to.
So that leads me to my next question. So we talked about how the lower income families who are possibly living in apartments who really don't, probably would be less likely to have EVs or be interested in EVs. they're buying gas cars. Well, now how you're saying that these SUVs or these gas cars are now going up in price, and the people who are generally interested in them are the people who have lower income. And so that kind of creates like a,
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, these SUVs tend to be more expensive. So that's where the car companies make most of their profit is from the bigger vehicles, big pickups, big SUVs. So actually, it's kind of good from an equity perspective. In the sense that it will make those cars that are purchased by actually more affluent. You know, maybe poor people end up with the SUVs at the end, but that's like the end of the food chain, you know, and when they're, you know, after the richer people sell them, and then it goes, you know, second or third used vehicle. And then they end up being cheap because they're gas guzzlers, and if you don't have a lot of money, you don't want a gas guzzler. So that's kind of one of the sad reasons a lot of low-income people end up with big vehicles, because they're cheap, because they're not doing the TCO analysis either. So you should do it on a used car, just like a new car. I mean, theoretically. So, okay, so e-buses. So low carbon fuel standard credits. Have you heard anything about low carbon fuel standards? I don't think so. Okay, I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Okay, so another part of this. So with cars, remember I said the regulated party is the car company, not the consumer. Well, with trucks, we CARB are about to adopt another regulation that is going to make the consumer the regulated party. But the consumer in this case are the fleets. You know, is UPS, you know, is, you know, FedEx, is the University of California, you know, that own a lot of trucks. So we are passing a requirement that, you know, that the ACT is that the truck companies must sell, manufacturers must sell them. And now we're going to have another regulation on the fleets that they must buy them. And we're going to try to make it so that, you know, the requirements to buy more or less match selling. You know, because if you think about it, you talk about what's equitable and fair. You know, usually we think about people that are low income when we think about equity. But if you think about it for companies, we're telling a company, you must sell this, but what if no one wants to buy it? We're basically pushing them into bankruptcy. Is that fair? No. So, and that's why we're doing this requirement, to make the fleets buy them. To try to make it easier for the manufacturers to sell them.
You say it's not fair to have,
That word fair is a really tricky one.
okay, and you say it's not fair to have the car companies sell only a certain amount of those kind of cars. How is it fair to force these fleets to buy? I understand the whole
Yeah,
point and
I
everything,
know.
but
It's,
you know, some things you gotta.
that's why I'm saying
You
this
gotta
word,
break some things, you know.
Right. and this word fair and equity is like way overused, often inappropriately, and almost never defined. And so I was being a little provocative, but it is true, you know, if you're okay, what's fair, you know?
Making them make a smart investment. Or you want to say that.
But even here's another way of thinking about it. So we say that I think is if you have 50 trucks, you are subject to this rule. But if you have 45, you're not. Is that fair? I mean, we have politically, we say, and this is in this country generally, in California especially, if you're a small business, you know, that's what it means, then we're going to treat you better because we think you need more help. And because we believe philosophically that small businesses are really important to our economy and communities. Is that fair?
ECI policy is so complex in that sense. Sure.
So be careful whenever you use fair and equity. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the low carbon fuel standard. I think it's one of the best policies we've ever adopted. And oh, by the way, I played a big role in designing it. So I'm partial, I confess. So the history of this actually is Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was governor, his office called myself and a professor at Berkeley and said, we have this idea of some kind of, standard for fuel suppliers and climate change. We don't quite know how to do it. Can you figure out how to do it? So we put together a team of students and postdocs and professors from Berkeley and Davis, and we came up with this. This was 2007, and CARB. So I wasn't on CARB at the time, and then CARB actually took it, our proposal, and adopted it almost exactly how we proposed it. So I am a little biased, but I've heard many people say this is one of the best policies California ever adopted. Okay, so what it does is, so here, the regulated party is the oil company. Actually, technically, it's the refineries. And we tell every refinery in California, you must reduce the carbon intensity of your fuel that you sell by a certain percent, every year. So it was adopted in 2009, and it said by 2020, you have to reduce the carbon intensity measured as measured as gram of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. You have to reduce, the energy intensity of the carbon intensity of the fuel you sell by 10% by 2020. And then a few years ago, we extended it, and now they have to reduce it by 20% by 2030. So if you're an oil company, how do you reduce the carbon intensity of your fuel? Okay, you can make the refinery slightly more efficient, but there's no way to get a 10% improvement. And so the real motivation was to promote alternative biofuels, natural gas, anything, renewable natural gas, anything that had a smaller carbon footprint. So in this case, just like the story with Tesla and the car companies, so in this case, the oil companies must reduce the carbon intensity, but they really can't do it very easily. So what they do is they buy credits from other companies that do sell low carbon fuels. So they buy, so if you're an electric utility and you sell electricity to electric vehicle, then you generate credits, LCFS credits. If you sell renewable natural gas and it's used in a vehicle for a vehicle, you get credits. If you sell low carbon, if you make ethanol, corn ethanol, in a really efficient low carbon way, you get credits. So all those companies, they sell their credits to Chevron and Exxon, and you have a transfer. So basically, one of the reasons I think it's a great policy, and many others too, it's the oil companies subsidizing everyone else to come up with low carbon fuels. Yeah.
You mentioned specifically that the electricity is just to use it without any credit, or would it be?
It's very specific that only get credit if they sell the electricity. Okay, now how does anyone? How do you? No. So in the beginning, we thought everyone would have a special meter for their, where they would meter how much electricity are, and they would report it. That hasn't. So there are some. So what we've done is we put analytical exercise. Data we have collected for PGE, we see X percent is going to these, we extrapolate, which is probably not exactly accurate, but close enough, hopefully. But if you run a charging station, then you know, because if you have a charging station selling directly to vehicles, that electricity really is being sold in vehicles, so they can claim credits. So the beauty of this, okay, so everyone, you know, all these other low carbon fuel suppliers are getting credit money, but electricity is a little different. So it goes to the charger company, so that provides an incentive for them to put in more chargers, sell more electricity. Basically, it reduces their cost. With electric utilities, it's a little trickier. So what we've done is we made a deal with electric utilities, and we said, okay, we're going to take 65% of the credits of the revenue you get from your credits, and we're going to take it from all the utilities in the state. We're going to bundle it together, and we're going to create a rebate program for electric vehicles. So if you go to your dealer and buy an electric car, there will be a rebate. Right now, it's $800. It was $1,500. Hopefully, it'll go back, and you get that rebate. So that's a purchase incentive. For bus companies, it's been really great because basically it covers all the costs of their energy use, of their electricity use in buses. It's worth about 15 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So basically, it covers their electricity costs. So it's kind of like helping out those transit agencies that really desperately need help. All right, so that's what I said. You know, the price. So these are tradable credits. So again, it's a private market like with Tesla. So in this case, the credits have been really worth a lot. In the beginning, they weren't worth much. There were lawsuits. No one believed it, or a lot of investors didn't really believe it was going to work or happen. And the credit price was like $30, $40, $50 a ton. And then the court cases were resolved, and the carbon intensity requirements increased. So the credit price went up to $200 a ton. And $200 a ton, that's a lot of money. You know, $200 a ton of carbon. So that's like, so anyway, so that's a lot of money. So but what's happened is it was so effective that sucked a lot of new investment in. So you might have heard some of the oil refineries in the Bay Area are switching from oil to renewable diesel. They're going to take like waste oils and other materials, but also they're going to take soy oil. They're going to make a fuel that's basically a diesel fuel. And so they're going to get a lot of LCFS credits. So they're killing the market. So the price has gone from 200 down to about $100. What we're going to do at CARB, we don't sit still. What are we going to do about it? We're going to raise that carbon intensity requirement. So it's 20% for 2030. I think we're going to raise it to probably, it's 20%. We'll probably change it to be 25 to 30% in 2030. Really tighten it up, and that'll mean that'll be harder to get credits, and the credit price will go back up. So we haven't started the process, but that's almost certainly what we're going to do. Okay, so, and the other beauty, like a PHEV, this is also free to consumers or taxpayers, not to consumers. It's free to taxpayers because who's paying? It's the oil companies paying. So now that does push up the price of gasoline and diesel, but again, that's what we want. Well, Governor Newsom doesn't want it. A lot of people don't want it, but in the big picture, that's what we want. We want to change the price signals so that gasoline and diesel and fossil fuels are more expensive and cleaner fuels are less expensive. Okay, so that's what we're doing here. All right. So That's why. Okay, I'm gonna go real quick. So these are slides, actually, doctored them up a little bit from Alan. He wanted me to talk about EVs internationally, and he'll pick up anything I don't do. So I'm gonna go through this quick, just make a few points I want to make. He'll probably go over it again, but you know, the real point is the US is lagging way behind the rest of the world. But not the rest of the world. It's lagging behind China and Europe. Actually, Japan is even worse, but we can get into that. Why that is. Actually, one of the main reasons is Toyota, which is one of the biggest companies in Japan, convinced the government that they should be introducing hydrogen, not BEVs. But then they don't really do much about it. And so the government hasn't done much about BEVs. So now they don't have BEVs going to it. So you'll see. Okay, so the country that has done the most and been the fastest at transitioning is Norway. So Norway is now, well, here's a graph. So this is from a year ago. And you see Norway was at 75% market share. 75% of all vehicles sold were BEVs or PHEVs. But even if you look at other countries, so here's the US down here, pathetic. And all these other countries are doing, much better than the US. So this number is up about 4% now. Although half of this is in California. Anyway, so all these numbers have gone up through all these. So this was from, I think, 2020. Ask Alan, but I think it was 2020. So China is up around 15%. Germany is up to over 20% now. So the point is, European countries and China are doing much better than these. And this is just, you can look at it for Norway, but Norway has a few special advantages. One is it's an affluent country to start with. It's an industrialized affluent. Do you know where it's gotten a lot of its money? Oil and natural gas. But what they've done is they've taken that money from oil and natural gas and created a special fund for the country. They saved it. They didn't just, fritter it away like most people in most countries. And so now they've been using a lot of that money to subsidize EVs. So, they have not used a mandate in Norway. They've just used massive incentives and subsidies to convince people to buy them. So now basically they're expecting Norway to be essentially 100% within a few years. And so, and these are all the incentives, up here that Norway offers. So it's not just, reduced. So actually they have huge taxes on gasoline. So all they have to do is reduce the tax that they impose on cars, for EVs, and that accounts for, $20,000, $30,000 right there, just by reducing the sales tax. That tax. So they do all these different things to make them profitable. So Norway's very rich. Number one, Norway's only has 5 million people. The Bay Area has more than 5 million people. So Norway is like, they're able to do a lot more because they're a small country with a lot. Okay. So this is all Norway. The rest of Europe. Okay, so what's interesting about Europe is they've used a completely different policy to make this transition than California is using. So California, we're mostly using the ZEB mandate. We're doing other things, of course, incentives and this and that. But what Europe has done is they've taken their CO2 performance standard, like our greenhouse gas standard for vehicles. They have the same thing, but they're doing it much more aggressively. Okay, so they're adopting really aggressive emission standards for vehicles. And the only way the car companies can meet that emission standard is by doing a lot of electric vehicles. And so they're using just a very aggressive emission standard to motivate sales of EVs. Whereas in California, we're doing it more directly through a ZEB mandate. But it's working very well. So you can see here, you know, some of the standards, 130 grams per kilometer, which is about 43 miles. That was in 2015, and then it went down. So just really aggressive standards. And this is actually just more of the same. You can go look at it. And they're working, as I said. And you see, so here's for 2021, you see that yeah, okay, so these are market shares overall. But you can see that, you know, Europe, this is Europe, look how fast Europe has been increasing. So it's even gone above that, 2022, it's even considerably. And then there's China. So China has, they have a ZEB mandate. In fact, we at ITS Davis played a big role in that. So we have a China Center at the Institute, and Yu Wang heads up the China Center, and he, with a team of our people, spent a lot of time helping the Chinese take California's ZEB mandate and adapt it for China. And they used California as a model, and they adopted a ZEB mandate that looks a lot like California's. So we, you know, some of our folks at ITS actually played a big role in it. So it's interesting in California, I mean in China, so in the beginning, most of the EVs in China were all these very clunky, junky, small cars. You know, they only go 50 miles, a range of 50 miles, and they were small, you know, they didn't cost much, but they could get that incentive money from the government. The government wasn't so savvy about figuring out exactly, make sure the money went exactly how they think it should have gone, you know. So it went to these small vehicles, but it got the market started, and now it's growing, and now it's, you know, it's a massive industry. And so you say, why is China, so this is my last big thought, you know, why is China pushing so hard on these? Okay, there's, I think it's 4 reasons. Anyone? So some of you would know some of the reasons. What are they? Why is China so excited about it? Yeah. Yes, air pollution. They have horrible air pollution. So it's a good way to reduce air pollution. That's one. What else?
Price of oil, or who they're buying oil from?
Exactly. They have huge, they're the biggest oil importer in the world. And so this is a way to reduce their dependency on foreign oil. Of course, we're buying some from Russia right now. That's a separate issue. Yeah, okay.
They want to try to lead market.
Yes, exactly. It's an industrial policy. It's leapfrog. They tried to compete with the rest of the world, the Western car companies and Japanese car companies with gasoline vehicles, and they never really could. So now they're saying, okay, you all can keep your gasoline cars. We're going to leapfrog over that to electric vehicles, and then we can start really exporting and become a powerhouse. Yes. And the fourth one is actually probably should have been the most obvious for this class, but it's also probably the least important for China. Environmental climate. Yep. I mean, air pollution is probably more important, but they are trying to reduce greenhouse gases. So that's it. Hold on, let me just see if there's any interesting slides here. Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks. You're done with me.
Listen to you, like, quickly.